The undead armada had blockaded the town and the PCs were determined to stop them. The Infernal and the Sidereal managed to sneak aboard the lead ship where they confronted the abyssal, blooded Sickle in Rust. He wasn't just the story's villain. He was the one who had ruined the Ashmouth clan and caused the Infernal's path of vengeance. It was personal. The fight inside the Abyssal's cabin was fast, deadly and cinematic. Blood Apes blocked the door to provide the opportunity for the Infernal to confront his nemesis alone. The Sidereal dealt with ghostly sailors on the deck outside, waiting for the Infernal to finish what he had to do. The battle was tight and hectic. The ship rocked beneath them, and just as the tide seemed to turn, the Infernal slammed his enemy through a large window and sent him crashing into the sea. But he couldn't linger. He had to grab what documents he could and retreat to shore before his powerful foe would find himself back up on the ship. This is what I think Exalted Essence does best. Combat feels quick, cinematic and impactful, while still letting characters feel powerful. The game succeeds at delivering the high-energy mythic action that Exalted is known for. But after completing my first full scenario, I found myself wondering if that's enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. In this video, I'm going to break down my experience with Exalted Essence, what worked well, what felt lacking, and ultimately who I think this game is for. It isn't a traditional review more than it is an impression after a couple of sessions of play. I'm not going to delve into the intricacies of the book or the system, only talk about my experience with it. Exalted games tend to be divisive, and this one is no different. I have both good and bad things to say. I've been a fan of Exalted for years. I started in 2007, back when 2nd edition was in full swing. Over the years it's been my go-to game, and I used to be the kind of dedicated fan that spent my waking hours writing homebrew and interacting with the community. I don't have time or interest in engaging much with the community today, but I am a casual lurker and try to keep up to date. Exalted has always been a complex system. I don't really mind, since I was practically raised on complex systems, but streamlined games are the current trend in the tabletop RPG space, and I was curious to see if Exalted Essence could pull that off without losing what made Exalted special. As much as I enjoy crunchier systems, they can be a barrier to entry. And my experience in recent years is that Exalted has gone from being celebrated to being largely rejected online. My hope was that Essence would strike the perfect balance, cutting down on bloat while still feeling the same. For my group's first Essence campaign, I adapted parts of the 2nd edition scenario Disease of an Evil Conscience to provide a few initial story beats. I then heavily reworked the threat to fit my group's characters and narrative. I moved the setting to the west, designed a custom island called Grizzled Shore, and positioned it near the Skullstone Archipelago. We tied all the pieces together and to the setting during session 0, and the first session started with solo prologue scenes tailored for each PC. First we had Lime Ashmouth, an Azimuth-cast Infernal who was originally from Grizzled Shore. His entire clan had been wiped out by the abyssal blooded Sickle in Rust, who was also the main bad guy behind the scenario's main conflict. Lime was combat-focused and had a personal stake in the island's conflict. Then there was Ophelia Nayad, a no-moon-cast lunar who had spent her life sheltered on a nearby island hidden in mist. She had a barn owl form, specialized in healing and sorcery, and was searching for her mother, who had left her island and never returned. She also had a lunar-solar bond with Lime, which added some interesting dynamics since it was an infernal. And finally, we had Fanren Guanlao, a chosen of Endings Sidereal tasked by the Department of Endings to locate an artifact in Lime's possession. Originally he joined the group under false pretenses, spying on them while investigating the new Infernal Exalted. He also had a mentor, Ohan Lei, the goddess of tea, who he communicated with via teacups. So the characters were all unique and had personal stakes in the story. But how did things turn out? Let's start with the positives, because despite some issues I had with Exalted Essence, it does a lot of things right. First, there are improvements to the combat system. It flows faster than 3rd edition. This is much due to how the power system differs from 3rd edition's initiative system. Instead of tracking the momentum of battle by a constantly shifting initiative, the power system in essence is more like how you build up power in a fighting game to eventually unlock a decisive move. In 3rd edition you could reduce an opponent's initiative by building up your own. In essence, both sides build it up without reducing the others. This guarantees that one side will eventually have enough power to launch their decisive attacks, making combat quicker, but also reducing the risk for one side to be totally overwhelmed by the other and not have an opportunities for launching decisive attacks of their own. Essence also lets you decide how much power to invest in a decisive attack, while 3rd edition forced you to use all of your initiative. This provides additional opportunities for being strategic in combat while still feeling powerful and while keeping enemies threatening. For the most part, the combat system worked well when we played. The big fights felt fluid and had momentum instead of dragging out or falling into the common pitfalls of 3rd edition's combat system. The most cinematic scenes, like the ship battle I described earlier, felt like they had weight, but they also kept the story moving forward. I find myself recalling the scenes themselves rather than the mechanics and the dice rolls, which I find to be a good thing. The first major fight scene of the scenario involved zombies and a spine chain at a ruined village. All player characters got to contribute in their own way during the fight, and the infernal combat monkey felt like a badass hurling that massive spine chain into a house. Several sessions later, the Lunar fought an even larger spine chain on her own, while on top of a stage, hurling bolts of silver essence while dodging and weaving with the spine chain spiraling around her. Another thing that stood out compared to 3rd edition was the venture system. If you played Exalted before, you know that managing big in-game projects can be clunky, whether it's running an organization or constructing an artifact. There isn't anything new or special about the venture system itself, but it shows that you can easily remove a lot of the crunch and tie your projects into achievable narrative obstacles. It's simple, narratively focused, and easy for both players and the storyteller to resolve. Less micromanagement and more story progression. Then there's the charm system. This is a tricky one though, because I have mixed feelings about it. I'll say this. What is in the book is well written and impactful. There's far less bloat than in previous editions, and I never felt like I was wading through filler charms that existed just to pad out progression. The additional modes, which let you tweak charms for different effects, was a smart way of adding variety even to the generic charms. Essence does succeed in making players feel powerful. The Exalted types are closer to each other in balance compared to previous editions, but the modes and anima powers contribute to making them distinct. They still feel like legendary demigods. Some powers are designed to automatically work as well, but these are generally narratively focused powers, such as effects that let players ask questions to reveal story details. I appreciated that Essence understands that Exalted aren't just strong characters, they are world-shaping demigods. But, like I said before, there are things about Essence that frustrate me as well. One of the biggest issues I have with Essence is that it feels incomplete. It's like the book is trying to do too much at once, but didn't really stick the landing on most of it. Exalted has always had a wide variety of Exalt types, like the Solars and Lunars, but they have all been given books of their own before. Essence includes all 10 of them in a single book, which sounds great in theory, but in practice, this means each Exalt type doesn't get enough space to fully develop. Their charm selections feel too condensed, and as a result, some of them start blending together rather than feeling distinct. Like I mentioned before, modes and anima powers help distinguish them, but it doesn't reach all the way. I often found myself wanting more, but at the same time, the book already feels packed to the brim. It's a strange balance where there's both too much and not enough. And then there's a lack of no charm character options. Essence gives you the foundation for building a character, but it doesn't offer much in terms of artifacts, hearthstones, martial arts or spells. In fact, I had to homebrew and convert content from previous editions just to give my players the bare bones of options. There aren't even enough artifacts or hearthstones to cover all magical materials and aspects. A brand new player who doesn't have access to all their books would find the lack of customization disappointing. Another problem I ran into was some of the micro mechanics. While I think Essence succeeds at a macro level, there were details that felt off once we got into play. Weapons, for example, always had automatic successes to attacks, which means an armed character can't botch their attacks. I don't understand why they went with successes instead of added dice, since it removes tension and adds nothing. The virtue system also felt like it didn't contribute much. It exists, but it doesn't have the same impact as it did in 2nd edition, where you could invoke it to empower just about any action. And while I like the overall power system, I found the combat steps and charms close integration with them to be less intuitive than I'd hoped. It required a lot of pausing and checking cheat sheets before it felt natural. I also wasn't a fan of the new progression system. Essence lets you upgrade your character based on personal milestones, and if the group collectively hits a certain number of them, everyone advances together. In theory, this keeps progression tied to story beats rather than just tracking XP, which is an improvement from previous editions. But I found myself micromanaging it more than I wanted to. Eventually I ditched it and just handed out upgrades to everyone at certain story points instead. And this brings me to one of my biggest personal frustrations. I kept missing 3rd edition. Essence does a lot of things better than 3rd edition, but while I was running it I found myself wanting to go back to the main game. That doesn't mean that Essence is bad, it's just that as someone who has played Exalted for years, I couldn't keep myself from thinking, I wish I had access to the full system right now. Essence didn't feel complete, and while 3rd edition is far from complete as well, it has a lot more to offer me at the moment. This is why my current Exalted campaign is back in 3rd edition instead of Essence. Of course, this wasn't just my first time with Essence. My players had their own thoughts, both good and bad. One thing they all agreed on was that it was fun to have all 10 Exalt types in one book. They appreciated the variety, and for some of them it didn't feel like there was a lack of choice when it came to charm options. But others felt the exact opposite. They thought the lack of charms was the biggest drawback and they wanted more. One player liked the condensed ability spread, saying it made character creation smoother and the character sheet more manageable, but no player liked the condensed attributes. Also, that same player had issues with other aspects of the game being condensed, arguing that the limited charm selection during character creation meant fewer ways to differentiate your Exalt from others of the same type. As for the rules, one of my players said that Essence felt similar enough to 3rd edition that they barely noticed a difference in moment-to-moment play. It's worth mentioning that none of my players were asked to read a book or the rules, and that I offered cheat sheets, rules compendiums, and helped keep track of power in combat. There was a lot of accessibility efforts at the table, mainly because it was a new system and I wanted things to flow more smoothly for my players. They did say that it would be annoying to jump back and forth between the two systems though. They'd rather commit to one at a time and not switch too frequently, since the differences are just distinct enough to cause confusion. Would they play it again? Yes, but not immediately. One player mentioned that they would enjoy going back to Essence in the future, but that they would prefer to put some distance between it and 3rd edition, which we're playing right now. In the end, it seemed like my players' experience with Essence wasn't drastically different from other editions, and that's an important takeaway. For my group, Essence still felt like Exalted, just not necessarily different enough to make them prefer it over 3rd edition. One of the questions I had when starting up the Exalted Essence scenario was if it holds up for long-term campaigns. And while we didn't play long enough to ever turn the story into a long-term campaign, I still think the answer is, it depends. My impression is that Essence is weaker in the early game. The lack of starting charms makes characters feel more limited at first, and it takes time for them to develop into something that stands out. That's a big contrast to 3rd edition, where characters start out with too many charms. My sweet spot would probably be somewhere in between. But as the campaign progresses, Essence gets stronger. The more the characters grow, the more they start to stand out. Sure, Essence still lacks enough customization options, but just a few more charms are enough to make an impact on the characters. I think that if there were more supplements with content for Essence, it could stand really strong as far as customization goes. Characters in 2nd edition had a tendency of becoming overpowered and unwieldy in the late game. Characters in 3rd edition start out too bloated, which means that you don't have as strong a desire for further power progression. You can feel the progression in Essence, but another 2 or 3 starting charms would have helped a lot. So, would I say Exalted Essence is better for short scenarios or for long-form play? To be honest, I think it works well for both, but only if you're willing to homebrew a little. If you're running a long-term campaign, you're probably going to want more artifacts, spells and customization options to keep things fresh. If you're just running a short arc or one-shot, and you can live without these non-charm options, then what's in the book is enough to work with. Personally, I wouldn't mind running Essence again, even for a truly long-term campaign, but I want to see supplements released first so I don't have to keep converting content from previous editions. I wouldn't run the game again with just the core book. There is no perfect Exalted edition. It's never been perfect before and it will never be perfect in the future. However, Essence does a lot of things better than its predecessors, but it also loses something in the process, and that's going to make it a divisive game, depending on what you personally value in Exalted. First, let's talk about what it does right compared to 3rd edition. The combat is faster, the power system is smoother than 3rd edition's initiative system, and the overall structure is more intuitive. The game still has complexity, but it's not the same bloated mess that 3rd edition is. So if you liked 3rd edition but wanted something that runs quicker, Essence might be the better choice. But then we get to what it loses compared to previous editions, and I've already gone through my main criticism. I found myself missing things. The Exalt types don't feel distinct enough, and the lack of artifacts, spells and martial arts makes character building feel limited. Characters don't feel as mechanically unique as they do in previous editions. Then there's the fact that Essence includes all 10 Exalt types in a single book. I get why they did this, it's convenient, but in practice I think the game would have been stronger if it had focused on fewer Exalts and expanded on them more. Maybe start with 5, then add more as supplements. Because right now it feels like everything got compressed, which makes it hard for any individual Exalt type to really stand out. Would I recommend Essence to a brand new Exalted player, someone who's never picked up any of the previous editions? Yes, but with conditions. If you're coming from narrative-driven rules-light games, you might still find Essence too complicated. If you're coming from more complex games, you might appreciate it for what it is. If you plan to run the game, the core book will at least give you a storytelling chapter, but not enough lore depth to make you comfortable running the setting. You might want to pick up setting books from other editions. But if someone else is running the game for you, Essence might be the easiest way to get into Exalted as a player. Would I recommend it to an Exalted veteran? That's a more difficult question to answer. If you're comfortable with homebrewing your own content, you'll probably be satisfied with what Essence has to offer. If you're a big fan of 3rd edition's combat system but wish it were faster, you might prefer Essence. But if you love the intricacy and deep customization of older editions, you'll probably feel restricted. I think Essence captures the spirit of Exalted, but it also strips away a little too much in places. The foundation is solid, but it needs more content to truly feel complete. If you want a faster, more streamlined version of Exalted that still retains the high-powered mythic action, then Essence delivers on that. The combat flows better, and the game does a good job of making Exalted feel like demigods without getting too bloated by crunch. But if you're expecting Essence to be a fully complete Exalted experience, you might feel let down. The game feels unfinished in places. It has a strong foundation, but doesn't reach its full potential. To break it down, you should play Exalted Essence if you love the Exalted setting but want a lighter, faster system. If you want a cinematic, high-powered game with a decent amount of crunch, if you enjoyed 3rd edition but felt the combat dragged and want something quicker, and if you don't mind homebrewing content to expand on the system. You should skip Exalted Essence if you're looking for a rules-light game. It is streamlined but still complex. If you love deep customization and complex charms, Essence is more condensed. If you're happy with 3rd edition and don't feel the need for a more streamlined version, or if you're a fan of 1st and 2nd edition and disliked the withering decisive combat system, the power system still uses withering and decisive attacks. For me personally, I think Exalted Essence both promises and wants more than it can deliver. It proves the need and desire for a streamlined Exalted edition, but unfortunately it misses the mark for me in its current state. I wouldn't mind running it again, but I want to see more supplements first, so I don't have to convert material from older editions or write homebrew from scratch. As it stands, I appreciate what it does right, but I also kept finding myself missing 3rd edition while running it. But like I said, Exalted games are divisive. If you have played Exalted Essence, what do you think about it? And if you haven't, or you're interested in checking it out, let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in more Exalted content, I have published a few things for 3rd edition on the Storyteller's Vault. You'll find links in the description. I also made my own sci-fi game called Machineborn. You can access the latest versions of that game by either joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. I expect to release it for free later this year. Until next time.